I was this week years old when I realized something about the Bible I had never seen before. And frankly, I think a lot of Bible scholars don't realize this. All the time, I hear apologists obsessing over how we can trust the Bible manuscript tradition.
There are a number of other meaningful and viable variations in manuscripts, but none that are theologically significant.
But I think they completely ignore the elephant in the room. This is the first 200 years of the Christian movement when entire gospels were copying, stealing, reworking, so much so that we can see a web of interconnectedness in early Christian literature that people don't seem to ever notice. And once you see this pattern, the massive change happening within manuscripts at the earliest stages of the Christian tradition, I promise you, you will never again care about tiny little spelling mistakes, for example, introduced via copying of manuscripts by scribes. In this video, I want to show you a complicated web of early Christian manuscripts, and I promise you, if you get this, you will never look at early Christian writing the same ever again. But before we start, my name is Chris. I have a PhD in early Christianity. On this channel, I talk about the Bible and Christian origins, so if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing. So we're going to start with the most obvious one, and this is the quote-unquote synoptics. Now, a lot of people will know about this one, so this isn't too out of the blue, but we're going to use this as the base for everything else that I'm discussing. So the synoptic problem starts with the Gospel of Mark, and Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source. Matthew uses 90 to 95% of Mark's content, working into his Gospel, something like 600 verses, and Luke uses about 50% of Mark's material, that's about 300, maybe 350 verses. You can see this here in one of my favorite examples I like to give, which is from the story of the paralytic, which you can see shows up in all three Gospels. You get slight variations in how the story is told, but there is a literary connection at the root of this story. And you can see in Mark 2, 9 and 10, Jesus says, "Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up, take up your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic. So of course, this is the well-known synoptic problem. You can see the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's kind of where most people stop. I want to bring in the Gospel of John here, and I've just been finishing this new book by Mark Goodacre, who I'm interviewing tomorrow as I record this, and he argues very convincingly that the Gospel of John should be considered a synoptic. I think he's right. You can see that there is a literary relationship between John and the synoptics in different places. So for example, this text from Mark where they clothe Jesus in a purple coat and say, "Hail, King of the Judeans." Of course, this shows up in Mark, Matthew, and John. Or how about this text talking about the words of John the Baptist and the coming one? You can see it's not as extensive as the synoptics, but there is a relationship here too. And Mark Goodacre suggests very convincingly, I think, that John actually expands and reworks and retells synoptic material. So for example, he says that all of the I am statements in John are actually reworkings of parables and sayings from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So for example, when Jesus says, "I am the bread of life," you see themes from the synoptics of Jesus providing bread, feeding the 5,000, feeding the 4,000, and that sort of thing. So all of a sudden we now have four Gospels that have a dependent relationship to each other. And I think, frankly, that's where a lot of people stop. But let's keep this going a little bit. Let's look at the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a famous sayings gospel. It was found in Fragments at Oxyrhynchus in Greek and then in full at Nag Hammadi in Coptic in the 1940s. But even though this was a new gospel, there was something very familiar about it. In fact, 40 to 50% of sayings in Thomas have parallels in the synoptics. So for example, Gospel of Thomas 20, the disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us what the kingdom of heaven is like." He said to them, "It is like a mustard seed. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it falls on tilled soil, it produces a great plant and becomes a shelter for the birds of the sky." Or here's another example from Gospel of Thomas 65. I won't read the whole thing, but this is about a man who owns a vineyard, leases it to tenant farmers, sends his servant so that the tenants could give him the produce, and instead they seize the servant and beat him. The vineyard owner then sends his son, and the servants kill him. This is identical to a story we get in the synoptics. So scholars will disagree exactly about what direction this relationship takes between the Gospel of Thomas and the synoptics. Those who are convinced by the Q theory might say Q and Thomas have some kind of relationship. Otherwise, you might say Thomas has some kind of connection to Matthew and Luke, but either way, there is a connection. So we also get a Gospel of Thomas, which could also be considered synoptic, and which arguably knows something about the gospel traditions from our New Testament, either by influencing them or coming from a shared source, or maybe even relating to them directly. But that's not all that there is. We can look at other early Christian literature like the Protoevangelium of James. And I was getting this from Goodacre's book too, so I have to give him props for this because he kind of made me realize this. The Protoevangelium of James is an infancy gospel from the early 2nd century. Sometimes it takes details that are in narrative from the Synoptics and moves them into speech. This is one of the things Goodacre was talking about in his book. So here you can see similar words as Joseph considers dismissing Mary quietly. And here you can see another example of how the Protoevangelium adopts a story from Matthew when Herod inquires as to where the Christ was to be born and actually turns it into a speech by Herod. What has been written about the Christ? Where is he supposed to be born? So here in the Protoevangelium of James, we get another piece of early Christian literature drawing upon the Synoptics. Or an even more fascinating possibility that I'll talk about in a minute is that this material could come from a shared John the Baptist source that also influenced the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke. But we can go further than this because, as Goodacre also points out in his book, and I really have to thank him for this, and I'm looking forward to our talk tomorrow as I record this, the Gospel of Peter does the same thing. The Gospel of Peter reworks material from the Synoptics too. So for example, Gospel of Peter 4:12-13 says, "It was midday and darkness covered all Judea, and they became anxious and uneasy lest the sun had already set, since he was still alive. It stands written for him, the sun must not set on one who has been put to death." Or we have the words of Jesus on the cross where he says, my power, why have you forsaken me?" Very similar to what we get in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, with a small addition probably accounting for the author's theology. So at this point, if we chart out a relationship between all of these documents, it looks like this. But hold on, because we are just getting started. I want to introduce you to a gospel fragment that I did a full video on. You can see a breakdown here if you want to explore this, but this is P.Oxy 1224. This is a gospel fragment found at Oxyrhynchus, and it also has a couple stories, including some sayings material that you will probably recognize. P.Oxy 1224, it says, "The scribes and Pharisees and priests watching him were angry because he reclined in the midst of sinners. But Jesus heard them and said, 'The ones who are healthy have no need of a doctor.'" And here's another piece from this papyri. "And pray for your enemies, for the one who is not against you is for you." The point is, when we line this up with synoptic material, we can see that this is another gospel floating around. We don't know how widely it was distributed. We don't know what it looked like other than this fragment, but it clearly has some kind of a relationship with the synoptics as well. Or how about another lost gospel fragment, P.Egerton? I also did a full video on this too. You can see my breakdown here, but this one actually looks a little more like the Gospel of John. And in fact, I think it could be a source text for the Gospel of John, but at the very least, there's some kind of a relationship between it and the Gospel of John. For example, you can see this textual relationship here, where P.Egerton says, "Search the scriptures in which you think you have life. These are the ones who bear witness concerning me. Do not think I came to accuse you before my Father. The one accusing you is Moses, in whom you have placed your hope." They were saying, "We know well that God spoke to Moses, but we do not know where you are from." And if you look at this fragment is identical to the Gospel of John, but it's missing the Gospel of John's editorializing that you get from John 5 verses 40-44. We also have this recently discovered P.Oxy 5575 that seems to be a rework of synoptic material and the Gospel of Thomas. Are you seeing the pattern here? These three fragments are all different Gospels that all relate somehow to our four Gospels, maybe as earlier versions, maybe as later versions, maybe as like lateral versions, but in any case, these are contemporary Gospels. So at this point, our manuscript chart is getting a little messy, but it would look something like this. But hold on, because we're not done yet. You don't have to agree with me on this one, but I'm going to include it because I find it very convincing. I think it's likely that there was a sayings gospel hiding behind Matthew and Luke. And at this point, I've already showed you all of these interrelationships because people will often say to me, well, why wouldn't we have a copy of Q? Or I don't believe in Q because we don't have a manuscript. There are a lot of manuscripts we don't have. I hope that's very clear to you at this point. And scholars for 200 years have believed that there was another gospel that looked like Thomas, that was a sayings gospel that became the source for Matthew and Luke's saying materials. They share this material and Mark doesn't know about this material. I can't make the case for it right now, but here is a chunk of the Beatitudes typically considered to be from Q. Now I'm going to talk about another couple hypothetical sources, and I know this is where I'm going to get pushback. This is the basis of what New Testament scholars call source criticism, and sometimes it pisses people off, and sometimes we're kind of cautious to do this. But you have to stop and look at how many of these relationships we can already see in the texts that we have. We can see these texts using each other. So is it so hard to believe that there could have been other sources behind these Gospels? And I'm just going to mention two for now because I think they're the most interesting. Scholars have argued that there could be a gospel behind the Gospel of John. They call this the signs gospel. And this is based on the apparent setup of a different series of signs that we see in the Gospel of John. For example, when Jesus turns the water into wine at the wedding in Cana, it's called the first sign. The healing of the official's son in Capernaum is called the second sign. Again, it's very hypothetical, but let's put that here as a potential. Okay, so we are getting a chart of interrelationships here that is an absolute mess. All of these gospels are connected somehow. This is a chain of connection between these gospels. And for the most part, I think, and you'd have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but I think we would argue that most of these is more than just oral tradition. Most of these are literary traditions adapting and reacting to each other. We don't always know what these relationships looked like, but we can see that there were some kind of relationship there. But let's go one further. I interviewed James McGrath last week, and he argues very, very convincingly that there is a John the Baptist source that is probably hiding behind the Protoevangelium of James and also probably serves as the source material for Jesus' birth in Matthew and Luke. Now, if you want to watch the interview I did with him, you can see it here, but his argument is really, really convincing. And when you stop and look at the beginning of Luke, you can see the breadcrumbs that these are infancy materials that actually related to John the Baptist. He shows, I think, really convincingly that the earliest sources of divine implantation, a mother giving birth to a messianic figure, that these sources are actually about John and they've been reworked. This famous Magnificat, which is said by Mary, was probably originally by Elizabeth. We even have a couple of manuscripts that say Elizabeth here. So this thing that was assigned to Mary is probably from a John the Baptist source that is making Elizabeth thankful for the birth of John, thankful for her own divine implantation of a baby without a human male involved. We could also talk about the figure of Marcion, who is known for one thing. What is it? He had his own Bible. And what was his Bible? It was a different version of the Gospel of Luke. Now, is this really that hard to understand after all that we're looking at here? Is it really that hard to see why Marcion could have a different version of the Gospel of Luke? After all that we can see in all of these sources is writing and rewriting of sources. But at the very least, I hope you can see these interrelationships. Or how about examples we have of different stories being added to manuscripts? For example, I talked about the famous and controversial source Secret Mark. I did that in this video here, and it may, we don't know if it's authentic, but it may show a different secret version of Mark in which a man comes to Jesus at night for teaching, sort of reminiscent of Nicodemus, and there's a little bit of Lazarus mixed in there too. But this allegedly could have been in a different version of Mark. Or how about one that everybody knows, and I don't think anybody disagrees with? We have the story of the woman caught in adultery. This is the famous pericope adultery between John 7 and John 8, which isn't in any of our earliest manuscripts. We can also see the ending of Mark tacked onto a tradition later. And if we map out all of this, it looks like this. This is an absolute mess, but this is the origins of Christian literature. This is the relationship that's worth untangling. And I can't even begin to tell you how important it is to recognize that all of this happened before the year 200. So when people take manuscripts, the earliest manuscripts we have are pretty much from the 4th century. When people take manuscripts and take like 4th century on and lots of Byzantine manuscripts and try to argue that by doing textual criticism, we can understand what the original gospel writers wrote. When people argued that from these 4th century manuscripts on, we get such a small amount of textual differences and therefore we can trust the tradition, when there's this entire web of interconnectivity and rewriting and editing and rewriting again in the first 200 years of Christianity that we frankly can't even untangle. We have no idea even how to untangle it, and we don't have all the sources that could untangle it, and there's probably still even more sources that we don't know about. After all, Luke even says that much at the beginning of his gospel. And that's why, frankly, I think textual criticism as a way to try and figure out what authors originally wrote is an absolute waste of time, because we have no idea. We don't even have a reliable way of recreating what authors really wrote because it is such a mess. And it's actually way more interesting this way. And there's huge, huge questions we can ask from this. How did these relationships work? What does it mean that all of these ostensibly knew each other? This is giving us some kind of like almost single early Christian literary network. That's kind of interesting. But so much of biblical scholarship is focused on these four gospels, on the canon, and people can't really see past that. But if you look at this web of interrelationships from the first 200 years, I hope you can see what I see. This is fascinating to try to untangle, but we might never get there. And that's just the reality. Early Christian literature is an absolute mess. I think, frankly, the idea of an autograph isn't even really one that's worth thinking about. But the one thing we can say that I think is really interesting is that most of what we see seems to be riffing on each other. I hope this was interesting to you. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take a second, consider doing that. I talk about the Bible and early Christianity. Do check out my podcast as well. It's called Footnote Famous. You can find it at footnotefamous.com or on any major podcast platform. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I'll see you next time.